So I first became an admirer of Frank Lloyd Wright's work when, fresh from the University of Sydney, I walked down the ramp of the Guggenheim Museum in New York. And so it really is both an honor and exciting, half a century later, to be here as the guest of the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation. But I must also say it's very daunting to be faced by so many people who know so much more about architecture than I do. But my hope is, oh, they're having such a good time there. My hope is that we can nonetheless establish a dialogue. So rather than just try to dazzle you with the latest findings of neuroscience, I want to try in my own way to give you some sense of the interaction between neuroscience and architecture, not to tell you what it is, but rather to open up your discussion of what it is. But before I do that, let me suggest that there are a couple of ideas about what is architecture and what is neuroscience. What is architecture? Well, you know better than I. I was struck by an interview recently on NPR. In this interview, he made a very nice threefold distinction between buildings, inhabited space that just does its job, sculpture, where form dominates, sort of the example of a very pretty-looking concert hall with lousy acoustics, and architecture, where somehow the two magically come together. And so that idea of the seamless marriage of form and function, I think, is what, for me, characterizes great architecture. So that's that. You each can fill in those aspects of architecture that you want to bring into our study. The main point I want to get across is that neuroscience is a subject of vast complexity with many details. So some people will look at the overall structure of the brain, look at the cellular details and say, okay, this is area 44, it's implicated in language, this is area 17, it's primary cortex, and just try to characterize the brain in terms of these great structures. Other people may get into different areas of the brain and say, look, the shape of the neurons is different, the connectivity of the neurons is different. How can we probe the details of this circuitry to understand how each part of the brain does its job? Or we can penetrate down and look at the individual synapse under the electron microscope and look at its structure, the connection point between the neuron. And others even get within the synapse and come up with pathways implicating 20, 30 different molecules, which allow the synapse both to allow one neuron to talk to another, but also allow that synapse to change, making the brain plastic, allowing us to learn from experience. But we also have some new tools in addition to this passage from the molecular to the neurochemical. We have brain imaging studies where we can put somebody in a scanner, ask them to do a task, ask them to do another task, and then see which parts of the brain are more engaged. And then finally, I want to emphasize the social dimension, that our brains didn't evolve just to do fancy computations in our heads. They didn't just evolve to allow us to interact with the physical world. They evolved to allow us to be social beings. So that, in a nutshell, is what neuroscience is all about. And the dazzling challenge for us is which of those levels matters when we discuss a particular aspect of architecture? Where do we follow the study? Okay, that's part 0.1. Now, the next thing I want to do is try to decompose the way in which we might link the brain and the building, as it were. And to step back from the brain for a moment, I think we can talk of a virtuous circle in neuroscience. Namely, that to the extent we understand how people experience buildings, so we can come up with a better design, to the extent we understand how buildings are designed, to that extent we can improve the education of new architects, the expression of new architectural ideas. So there's a virtuous circle between understanding design and understanding experience. And so the suggestion is we can move that over into the domain and ask, well, can we learn more if we look at the neuroscience of design? Can we get some more traction if we look at the neuroscience of the experience of architecture? And then I want to add a third element that was advertised in the introduction, neuromorphic architecture, the idea that maybe we can allow buildings to become part of our interactive social community by endowing them with what I'll call an information infrastructure whose design is informed by our understanding of the brain. Okay, so I want to mention three people, and you can see the covers of their books as I do so. The first is John Paul Eberhard, who wrote a book called Brain Landscape, and he is in some sense the founder of this notion of the neuroscience of the experience of architecture. He was also the founding president of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And he basically said, to the extent that we can better understand the brains of people experiencing architecture, so architects can better design. And in particular, he was interested in the fact that there's a diversity of tasks. If you're designing a hospital versus a school versus a workplace versus a church, then there are different aspects of the mind to understand. Can we enrich that understanding by getting down into some of the underlying neuroscience? Neuromorphic architecture. This is a topic that I've talked about and is recorded as a video on the website of the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. So let me just give you that URL, www.anfarch.com. And I urge you to go there even if you don't want to look at my video, because there's a great deal of interesting material where architects give talks responded to by neuroscientists and vice versa. We had our first international conference just a month or so ago, and there are materials for that that are being posted, and so on. But then the third element is the neuroscience of design, and the book I chose to anchor that has already been mentioned, namely Harry Malgrave's The Architect's Brain. And what's interesting about that book is that the first part is to go through the history of architecture, trying to say what is the, as it were, cognitive style of each architect in this historical review, and what might one infer about the brain of those architects as they do their craft. And then the second part is to review some contemporary neuroscience to try and close the circle. So our discussion is, why should you care? And the answer is, well, hopefully quite a few of you are here because you already care. And the discussion that ensues hopefully will carry some of you a little further into caring about this topic. So here we are. And the crucial point, apart from for Barbara that Neutra is on the screen, is that the last architect mentioned is Dorsal. And so this makes the transition because, as I've already suggested, where we overlap is in our concern with the hand. And Johanni's written this beautiful book, The Thinking Hand, and I have thought a lot about the neuroscience of how the eye and the hand are integrated. And so what I thought I would do to sort of get some cred with architects is take a number of quotes from The Thinking Hand and say, okay, given this linkage, as it were, of a concern for the hand and embodied experience with architecture, let's now look at the brain mechanisms that may be involved in some of these things and see to what extent that can enrich our understanding. And then in some sense, it's up to you to understand how and if we can carry that back into architectural design and practice. But here are the three quotes that I will start with. And I'm not going to discuss them yet because I'm going to come back later after we've met the brain. And then I will come back and offer you my neuroscience gloss on them. But firstly, the knowledge and skills of traditional societies reside directly in the senses and muscles, in the knowing and intelligent hands, and are directly embedded and encoded in the settings and situations of life. Secondly, the hand is crucial to the evolution and manifestations of human intelligence. Thirdly, human consciousness is an embodied consciousness. The world is structured around a sensory and corporeal setting. And then the next two claims I'll be coming back to. Learning a skill is not primarily focused on verbal teaching, but rather the transference of the skill directly from the muscles of the apprentice through the act of sensory perception and bodily mimesis. And then finally, something which obviously has my support as a very much involved in mirror neurons, is that the capacity of mimetic learning is currently attributed to mirror neurons. And this obviously will anchor a lot of what I have to say. But I also want to just give two quotes to which I will not add anything today, but which are exciting challenges for future discussion. The first is that architectural ideas arise biologically from unconceptualized and lived existential knowledge rather than from mere analysis and intellect. And I jump on the word mere. I say, come on, analysis and intellect aren't mere. So the issue is not to say that, down with intellect, up with the hand, but rather to understand more richly how the intellect and the embodiment come together to inform our everyday life and our architectural practice. And then the other is very intriguing. Beauty is not a detached aesthetic quality. The experience of beauty arises from grasping, interesting metaphorical use of grasping, from grasping the unquestionable causalities and interdependence of life. And here, I want to both agree with that, yet jump on that word unquestionable. Because one of the things we really know is that different cultures don't question different things. So in a sense, what is it about the human brain that allows us to have these unquestionable intuitions about causality and interdependence, and yet meet somebody from a different culture or a different religion or a Republican or a Democrat, and that's not... I mean, those Kenyans born in Indonesia, I ask you. All right. So I can finally start my talk because we have all the background in place. So the title I'm going to work with is From Hand to Symbol and Back Again. And let me start with this beautiful picture from my colleague Mark Genero, who died just a few months ago. And what I think that Johanni will be pleased is this is clearly a picture of a hand that can think for itself, because it's not connected to anything else. But what this is showing is that as you reach to grasp, you not only are getting the hand into the right place for the grasp, but you're already pre-shaping the hand appropriately to the object. So it's, for us, phenomenologically, if you will, it's a seamless whole of combining the location and the shape of the object into this single integrated act of arm and hand. But in fact, if people have damage to a certain part of the cerebellum, it's no longer seamless. So what they have to do is sort of open their hand like this and move it to the object. Then when it hits, they'll use the sense of touch instead of vision to guide that final grasp. So that's going to be one of, I would say that's perhaps one of the dominant themes here, that what to us, before we know about the brain, seem like with a D, two E's, a seamless, a unity, may in fact involve different processes in the brain being coordinated and orchestrated. And so the sort of dominant question, I don't have the answer for you, but the dominant question is, in the future, will our understanding that there are these multiple processes allow architects to tap into them in separate ways to achieve ends that could not be achieved by looking at the seamless whole of our normal experience? So, now just a little bit of jargon. Dorsal and ventral, the top of our brain we call dorsal. Think of the dorsal fin of a shark, if you will. Ventral. And then I want to just show you two different pathways. Starting from visual cortex, we can go dorsally up to what is called the parietal lobe, and then into the motor cortex in front of the brain. Or we can go down ventrally to the inferior part of the temporal lobe, and then up. And then here's a lovely example of this division of things that to us just seem like seamless unities. That here we have a diagram, I remind you of the anatomy, and then above a little diagram saying here's this dorsal route up through parietal cortex, and from there we can get, in particular I'm focusing on grasp programming. What does the parietal lobe tell the motor system about how to grasp the object? And what about this other route through the infratemporal lobe? Well, an unfortunate woman in Italy had a shower and carbon monoxide came out of the heating unit and led to damage of her brain that basically blocked this ventral pathway. but left the dorsal pathway intact. Now here's the interesting thing. You would show her sort of a letterbox type slit, but it could be in different orientations. You'd ask her, tell me what the orientation of the slit is. She couldn't tell you. Even more intriguingly, well, pantomime it. Just turn your hand to show me. She couldn't do it. And she said, okay, imagine you're posting a letter. Perfectly, she would take the letter and orient it to go into the slit. Or you'd show her a cylinder, and you'd say, how wide is it? She couldn't tell you. Well, pantomime, she couldn't tell you. All right, well, just pick the cylinder up. And perfect correlation from the middle of her pre-grasp. So we've ended up with this idea that we have two different things going on. There's sort of what we might call the what system. What is the object? What are the attributes of the object we can describe explicitly? And those are the sort of things that might enter into planning our behavior. But once we've set on the plan, what are those fine motor parameters that allow us to grasp accurately, to move the hand and the arm and the rest of our body? So that decomposition of the what and the how is a very nice example, I think, of learning about the way the brain can do many things, but in a way that for our normal conscious experience, we have no sense of those differences. Now, turning to the monkey, Gennaro and I had a collaboration with Giacomo Rizzolatti in Parma in Italy and Hideo Sakata in Tokyo. And Rizzolatti and Sakata headed groups doing neurophysiology of monkeys, going in with a fine microelectrode, sitting on a single cell and trying to understand what made that cell active. And so, don't worry about where these little labels come from, but the important point is that a restricted part of the parietal lobe called AIP is where Sakata did his study. It's on our how pathway, that dorsal pathway. And what he found there was that when he monitored what a cell was firing for during visual experience, and he would show, let's say, a cube or a sphere or another object, it didn't care whether it was a sphere. It didn't care if it was a cube. All it cared was what was the grasp to be used for. And similarly, when Rizzolatti went forward into this premotor cortex area called F5, he found that what the cell's activity correlated with was the motor action. So it was in some sense setting up the motor program, what I'll call the motor schema. So a precision grip might be correlated with one cell, a power grip might be correlated with the activity of another cell. Let me just notice this word affordances. It's an important word in Sarah Robinson's book, Nesting. And we get this from J.J. Gibson. I think the easiest way to understand it is imagine you're walking down a street and somehow your peripheral vision picks up somebody on a collision course, so you step aside to walk around them and keep going. And the next day you get an aggrieved phone call from your friend who said, "Why did you ignore me yesterday?" And you say, "What?" And the point is you've got one system, the sort of affordances, pulling out of vision what you need for immediate action, versus the higher level, if you will, or at least the more ventral. Who is that? What is that? How does that enter into my decision making? So that's an interesting saying that we can go down from the high level of our human behavior and our experience, where already we can see some of this dissociation, and begin to look at the actual brain mechanisms, neuron by neuron, when we're in the monkey. Well, the most significant result that came out of this period when we were collaborating was from the group in Parma, and this was the discovery of mirror neurons. So we're sitting in area F5, and we find a cell that is really active for a precision pinch, let's say. And then what happened was one of the members of the team had a tray ready for the monkey to grasp a piece of food and pick up the food rewards, that you could observe him doing a precision pinch and get the firing of the cell. But in fact, the cell started firing when he saw the experimenter doing the precision pinch. So it turned out that among all the neurons involved in this complex linkage of vision and action, there was a subset, the mirror neurons, that not only cared about, hey, I'm helping you execute the action, but also were firing if you saw a similar action. And this study in monkeys inspired us at USC to do human brain imaging. We couldn't look at individual neurons in humans, but we could say, is there part of the human brain, a chunk of human brain that lights up as seen within a scan, that will be active both when a human is carrying out a range of grasps with the hand, but also when observing somebody else carrying out a range of grasps. And amongst the areas we found, one was an area called Broca's area. And Broca's area classically is thought of as a speech production area. So what should the recognition of hand movements be doing in relation to an area producing speech? Well, fortunately, I had come to know Ursula Bellucci at the Salk Institute, where that brain hovers above the courtyard, and she had been studying sign language aphasia. And what she reported was that Broca's area damage impaired sign language in exactly a parallel way to that in which damage to Broca's area in most people would affect their capacity for speech. So we stepped back from Broca's area as a speech region to Broca's area as a language region, and that led Rizzolatti and myself to publish in 1998 a paper called Language Within Our Grasp. And the book you just heard about is the culmination of another 12 years or so of worrying about the problem. But the basic idea then was to suggest that the evolutionary basis for language comes with that mirror system for carrying out and recognizing actions. But I've highlighted there the word basis because, hey, monkeys have mirror neurons. They don't have language. So something had to evolve in the way, not just of, hey, bigger and better mirror neurons, but a whole system of networks in the brain to allow us to have language in a way that other creatures couldn't. But anyway, here's the first half of my title. We've got from hand to symbol. And let me, in 2 slides, summarize what would normally take at least one full lecture. Oh, we have time? Thanks. So, the idea is that monkeys have a mirror system for grasping. We have a mirror system for grasping. So we infer that our common ancestor 25 million years ago had a mirror system for grasping. So that's our ground for an evolutionary analysis. And it turns out, hey, monkeys really can't imitate in any particularly interesting way. Apes have some quite interesting capacity for imitation. Let's call it simple imitation. So we can infer that 5-7 million years ago our ancestors had this simple imitation. But we have what I'll call complex imitation, and to cut a long story short, I'll just say it's the ability to look at somebody carrying out a sequence of actions and make sense of the actions and how they relate to each other and achieve various sub-goals. And that capacity then is something that evolved along the human line, and the idea is once you can get to that stage of making sense of somebody's actions, then some further evolution of the brain equipped us for pantomime. The ability to look at somebody's action in the absence of the object upon which the action would normally be executed, and say, oh, you're trying to tell me something about the action, or you're trying to tell me something about the object. Like if I do this, what does it mean? Bird flying, I want to fly. Please turn up the air conditioning. So the trouble with pantomime is that it's ambiguous, and it takes a lot of work to do it. So then the notion was that we evolved the capability for proto-sign to be able to conventionalize this. So no longer could you just go up to a stranger and expect them to understand what you're doing, but you could, within your own community, communicate far more effectively. And then the notion, and this is a controversial hypothesis, is that this gave us what I call a language-ready brain, that all the brain mechanisms were now in place in the early Homo sapiens 150,000 or so years ago. But they didn't have language yet. To get from being able to pantomime and proto-sign and things of this kind, and then to be able to use the speech apparatus, all that was in place. But to actually get language, to have a grammar that allows you to put lots of different words together to express lots of different meanings and hope to be understood, as indeed I hope you're understanding that, that required, I suggest, cultural evolution. It required a whole history of inventions to get us to the point where we are today. Okay, so if I may give you a double entendre, language is handy in 2 ways. Right? Not only have I shown you an evolutionary path from hand to language, but all those different stages occurred because they conferred an evolutionary advantage on our ancestors. It wasn't that there was some defined omega of language. At each stage, better imitation helps you with transferring skills, etc., etc., etc. So language is not only evolved on the top of the hand, but it's also useful. And so we come back to the notion that we've seen how imitation evolved in complexity, and then language is built on top of that skill in imitation, but also enriches it. So they complement each other. So that's the lesson I want to draw there. So now finally we can get back to those quotes from the thinking hand and just see what this framework I've outlined for you can do to take us from those crucial observations about the role of embodiment in architecture and see what happens when we try to begin to fill in some of the details of the neuroscience. So, first, the hand is crucial to the evolution and manifestation of human intelligence. Okay, we're in perfect agreement. The mirror system hypothesis is the attempt to work out that idea. Human consciousness is an embodied consciousness. The world is structured around a sensory and corporeal center. So here I want to make a distinction between the external world and the constructed world. We see the world in different ways. And so again, in terms of the interaction between brain and body and culture, we may have a different world from each other to some extent. And then the knowledge and skills of traditional societies reside directly in the senses and muscles, in the knowing and intelligent hands, and are directly embedded and encoded in the settings and situations of life. And so again, here I want to just say, okay, that's sort of a good high-level description, but we want to probe in and understand what we get by interposing the brain in these relationships. And then, just two more. Learning a skill is not primarily focused on verbal teaching, but rather the transference of the skill directly from the muscles of the apprentice through the act of sensory perception and bodily mimesis. And I just want to say, look, human imitation is complex, it's not direct, it's at a different level than the muscles, and verbal instruction can come in a crucial way. You sort of get that sketch of how to carry out a new skill, and then yes, you need that embodied experience to become truly skillful. But language gives you shortcuts and gives you some different types of understanding. And then the capacity of mimetic learning is currently attributed to mirror neurons. Well, I say yes and no, because what I've tried to get across to you is a central role for mirror neurons, but to give you some sense of the brain as a complex integration of multiple systems. And therefore, it's not just the mirror neurons, it's also what's beyond the mirror that works with the mirror neurons to yield these capabilities. Okay, so now I want to come back to one of my comments, which was we must distinguish the external world from our own construction thereof. And one of the really intriguing ideas in neurology that goes back 101 years to the paper of Head and Holmes is the idea of the body schema. And they said, well, the body schema is anything which participates in the conscious movement of our bodies is added to the model of ourselves and becomes part of those schemata. A woman's power of localization may extend to the feather of her hat. Now, as I look around this room, I sort of suspect there's a shortage of ladies who wear feathers on their hats. But what is a more direct experience for all of us who have experienced the, let's say, Arizona freeway, is that our body schema can expand to the limits of our car. And as we try to judge, can I change lanes and get into that gap? Our body is sort of magically extended to give us a pretty good estimate of where our body ends and whether it can fit into that gap as we navigate. But now again, I come into this, one of the things about the way in which our brain is mediating what to us seems a seamless unity. That if you have damage to the parietal cortex on one side, you may end up with what's called hemi-neglect. You lose half your body. A person with this syndrome can put on a shirt, pull up one sleeve, and then you say, well, what about the other? What other? And you say, well, look, but you get their attention. Look at this here. Look at this arm. I know the surgeon's playing a trick on me. He put that there. So it's just amazing that our sort of most basic personal reality can be messed up by a brain lesion, and it gives us some sense. So this integrity of the brain is quite important. Here's another example which moves us more into the world of architecture, that Bisiak and Luzzati, working in Milan, asked people with hemi-neglect to describe, say, imagine you're standing facing the Duomo in Milan. Describe what you see. And as indicated by this cartoon, they would just describe what was on the right side of the piazza. This is not blindness, this is recollection. And then you say, okay, I want you to now imagine you've walked up to the Duomo, you turn around, tell me what you see. They would describe the other half. Wow. Now, I just note here the title of a couple of papers that just appeared. One is The Right Hemisphere in Aesthetic Perception. The other is The Riddle of Style Changes in the Visual Arts After Interference with the Right Brain. Just to suggest that people are beginning to think about the implications of this sort of neurology for art. A somewhat different approach from the one of Semyonov we heard earlier. And so there may be interesting ways of extrapolating their work into the domain of architecture. Okay, again, thinking about, I sort of talked about extending the body schema by the motor car. Perhaps the most common way we extend the body schema is by tool use. And what's interesting is the tool use at the left, it extends our body to the tip of the screwdriver. And if we're hammering a nail, one might even argue that the body schema doesn't end at the head of the hammer, it ends at the tip of the nail. And this brings me to, again, back to this theme that has sort of been implicit, is that if we're to benefit from neuroscience, we're going to have to take advantage of lessons from non-humans. We already heard a very nice discussion of animal architecture from Dr. Dorsal, and I'm going to, in some sense, return to that. So one of the most exciting recent results on tool use by animals was the New Caledonian crow, shown here on a stamp from New Caledonia, who will take a leaf, cut it, serrate it, hold it in its beak, and use it to extract insects from the bark. And then a crow who had migrated to study at Oxford was confronted with a little bucket of food within a glass cylinder and given a piece of wire, and she spontaneously bent the wire into a hook to extract the bucket to get the food. So that's about as surprising a limit of the capability of a bird brain that you would ask for. But actually there is another thing, and that is constructing nests. That here we've shown an African masked weaver, but this is just one of many very different birds' nests. And so Sarah, in her beautiful little book, Nesting, Body, Dwelling and Mind, used the bird's nest as a sort of poetic grounding for her discussion. What I want to stress is that birds' nests, firstly, have very limited functionality. You put the eggs there, you raise the nestlings there, but that's it. And with some exceptions in some bird species. And the other is that they're species specific. The bird is clever in the sense they can adapt to the available materials and things like that, but they're just building this kind of nest. And so again, we're challenged to say, what can we learn from the mechanisms in the bird's brain that make that possible? But what is it that allows us, humans, to become architects who can face many functional challenges in many different ways? So again, that discussion between what do we learn from other brains, what do we have to understand that is unique to our own brains. And just one monkey experiment, the last one, is from a lab in Tokyo from Atsushi Ariki, and he studied two cells, or we're showing the results of two cells in the parietal cortex that could be stimulated both by touch and by sight. And the top row shows a cell that was responsive to touch on the hand. And before the monkey learned to use a tool, the visual stimuli that would get that cell firing were only those immediately around the hand. So it was involved in grasping. But if you taught it to use a rake to retrieve food that was otherwise out of reach on the tabletop, then the visual field extended to the whole raking area that was provided. Or if you looked at the shoulder girdle and a cell whose touch sensitivity, muscle sensitivity was up there, then normally the visual field would extend just to areas within reach of the monkey, but teach it to use the rake, and it extended to the whole area of the table that was within reach. And just one last observation that's quite intriguing. Iriki's colleague Fuji set up a table with two monkeys, each with a rake, And one was dominant and one was subordinate. And what would happen is if he placed food within reach of both monkeys by using the hand, the subordinate monkey would never try to grasp the food. But if you placed the food in the area where both could rake, the subordinate monkey would still go ahead and compete for the food. So this sort of, what is the basis of this subordination? So this is just a sense that there are lots of intriguing things we learn as we try to probe the capability and circuitry of the animal. Some of this will come back to be relevant perhaps to architecture, others will just enrich the architect's understanding but not really matter. Okay, so this is the last bit before I get into my summation. A debate, I think, between some people. In fact, there was it's discussed in the Thinking Hand. There was a recent internet chat group going on this. It's sort of sketch versus CAD. I mean, can you really come up with a decent design if you're not sketching by hand rather than using CAD? And so I start with this famous sketch of Frank Gehry's, and I think it may have some historical value, but if you were to hand this to you and say, okay, I'd like you to work on this building. So here we come quite a few stages later, and we get from a personal doodle to a medium for communication, where now we're beginning to specify enough, because architecture, after all, is a social process, both architects working with each other and with the builders and with other people, and also the architect interacting with the client in the first place and projecting into the future how the dweller will experience it. And now I just want to show this. You can't really see the details, but the point is this is the process whereby Gehry's group uses Catcher, an aerospace 3D system, to take what's interesting. It's in some sense Gehry is old-fashioned in that he's doing all these sketches, he's getting people to build little models, making more sketches, more models, and finally there's a full mock-up of the building with all its gory details. And only then, in this practice, do they come in and scan the three-dimensional building to go into the computer. But in this case, what the use of that scan is, by getting a complete three-dimensional representation, they can figure out, okay, where the curvature is slow, I can put a big metal plate. Where the curvature is fast, I better put in a lot of small metal plates. And so you go all the way from the 3D model to a shop drawing with the design and placement of all the plates, so both for the fabrication and the construction. And then finally there's a real building. And just returning to my original theme from NPR, to me the Guggenheim build-out, I've checked this with my wife Prue, is that I think in terms of an aesthetic experience, it's fabulous. You keep walking around and there's different plays of lights and the curvature of the building reveals new vistas. But the exhibition halls are really disappointing. They became secondary. Whereas if we go to the Disney Center in Los Angeles, a building that is clearly a first cousin of this building, then I think it's not quite as exciting aesthetically. But you go into the concert hall, and there Gehry was constrained by a master acoustician, Toyota, and it works on both levels, form and function. So I think that's just sort of an interesting idea. So let me finish this discussion of CAD, my fourth CAD slide. Actually, the 4 is a typo, but I found a way to pretend it was meant to be there. The last quote from the Thinking Hand: the computer creates a distance between the maker and the object, whereas drawing by hand or building a model puts the designer in skin contact with the object or space. In imagination, the object is simultaneously held in the palm of the hand and in the brain. We are inside and outside of the object at the same time. Ultimately, the object becomes an extension and part of the body, and this sort of fits in with that notion of the plasticity of the body schema. But what I want to close the meat of the lecture before the summing up is this really, I think, raises an interesting question for neuroscience. For those in the new generation of architects who have grown up with computers and CAD, it seems to me a reasonable hypothesis that they can imagine this extension of the body just as well as they sketch on the computer as others of us would imagine it as we sketch by hand. And certainly that doodle of Gehry's is not much of a body schema yet. So this could well be the basis for a study in cognitive neuroscience. How would we really probe for different people to what extent the sketch works for one and the CAD works for the other? And to what extent can we maybe come up in our design education of the optimal way, just as I do most of my writing on the computer. But every now and again it's good to take out the notepad and scribble for a while. Okay, so now just a quick reprise. This slide is all the beautiful slides you haven't seen, so the deja vu I was hoping to administer at that point is not going to happen, but these were the 3 slides of my swift tour of the multiple levels of neuroscience. And what I want to say is to give you a reality check, that it's not plug and play. The Society for Neuroscience has an annual meeting. At the moment, they're running to about 15,000 presentations at each meeting. So, and even worse, I'm sorry to say, that architecture in the sense of the built environment hardly figures amongst those 15,000. So we're really at a point where architects and neuroscience have to work together to design what are the meeting points. What are the new experiments in neuroscience? What are the questions that architecture can pose to the neuroscience? What are the answers that the neuroscientists can hope to offer? So it's a call to collaboration, not an idea of the neuroscience saying, hey, we really know about the mind. It just works this way in the brain. Just plug that in and you'll do better buildings. Okay, the other thing is I've tried to establish this notion of from hand to symbol and back again to say, well, the thinking hand thinks because it's connected to a brain, and then I've suggested this evolutionary pathway from hand to language. And I've used that example of hemi-neglect as sort of one indicator of the way in which what is for us a seamless conscious experience, in fact, requires the orchestration of many different brain systems at different levels of detail. And so as we bring that back to the neuroscience of the experience of architecture, we can try to say, what are the different combinations that go on in the minds of children as we're trying to design a classroom? Can we plug into the neuroscience of development? Or what happens when we build a working environment? What are the different skills that we're trying to exploit? Building a home for Alzheimer's patients. What do we do to create a supportive environment for them? One of the key issues is wayfinding. What is the right combination of tacit cues within the environment and explicit signage? Because there's a lot of work already done in neuroscience on the hippocampus and the parietal cortex in relation to wayfinding. And one very nice example is circadian rhythm, our sense of the 24-hour period. One of the things that happens in hospitals is every 2 hours, a nurse bursts into your room, turns on the light, and measures your blood pressure. And this messes up your circadian rhythm. So a real research issue is, how can we find what patterns of lighting will give the nurse what she wants without resetting the circadian clock? And here you can both do behavioral experiments on humans, but also go back to animal studies of the underlying circuitry of the suprachiasmatic nucleus or whatever, and get lessons that suggest hypotheses to now test in those human studies. Okay, the title of this symposium was Minding Design, Neuroscience, Design Education, and the Imagination. I've said a lot about neuroscience, but hardly touched on imagination or education. So let me just have one slide. Imagination, imagining the experience of the other. And I suggest that mirror neurons may well be important, but the point is, and this goes back to some of the remarks in the previous lecture, when you're the architect, you have to imagine not how you would experience the building, but how the client or the dweller would experience the building. So you have to go from just, oh, I recognize what they're doing, to building a full, as it were, a body schema of the other. So that's really challenging. And then education. An example for me is that, okay, at the moment we will teach architects quite a bit about structural engineering. But for many architects, in future life, they won't do the structural engineering, but they'll know enough to come up with a design that is a reasonable starting place for the structural engineer to fill in the details and then provide the feedback that refines this. So I could imagine in the future that we'll have courses on brain theory and artificial intelligence for architects, which says, okay, if you want a building that can appeal appropriately to the mind and brain of the dweller. Maybe that includes a neuroinformatic structure within it. Then this will tell you how to get started so you can then collaborate with experts in the, what should we call it, the architectural neuroscience of the future. So we come to the end at last, you say. We've charted 3 ways that we might focus this discussion of how architects and neuroscientists can talk to each other, with the neuroscience of the design process, neuroscience of the experience of architecture, and then off to the side, neuromorphic architecture. What I would be very interested in hearing from you. How can we move forward? So there's my email address, arbib@usc.edu, but even if you don't want to write to me, I really encourage you again to go to the ANFA website, www.anfac.org, and see, as it were, the early but intriguing state of the art of bringing architecture and neuroscience together. Thank you very much.